This video is going to outline the first few steps in setting up the foundation for your color painting. And the first thing you guys are going to do is actually something that is probably new to you that I want you to try. It's called setting a ground, which means to put a color of paint on your surface before you actually map out your composition and draw it. Now, I have my sketchbook page set up here. I'm actually going to do 2 color paintings, only so that I can show you a couple of different things with each painting. So I have mine set up a little bit smaller, but when you're deciding on the size to make your painting, you might want to go a little bit bigger, and that's going to depend on the proportion of your photograph once you choose your photograph. Okay, so backing up, we're going to talk about setting a ground and what that means and how to go about doing that. But before you do that, you have to figure out how you want to utilize your space. So I'd imagine many of you are using your sketchbook. You would want to be using the thickest quality, the heaviest quality paper that you have access to, because we're going to be using acrylic paint, so it requires a sturdier type of paper. You could even do an acrylic painting on watercolor paper, works well too, if that's the only thick paper you have. So try to get some sturdy, good, thick paper, and then you just have to decide how you're going to set up your paper. And look at your photograph and look at the proportions of your photograph. So my photo, I have it here on my Chromebook. I'm going to try to flash it in the screen. I've selected my plant photographs that I'm going to be working from, and I'm going to do, as I said, 2 of them. So I have them set up both on this paper. So they're a little bit smaller. I want you guys to go a bit bigger. We'll talk about sizes in a second. But notice how my format for my photograph is square. So I have to make sure that I'm working within a square for my painting, because when I go to draw this out, I don't want the proportions to get all mixed up. All right, if you are working in a rectangular format, you should set up so that you're working, maybe turn your sketchbook this way and be working in a rectangular format. Or if it's rectangular but it's horizontal, you can set up your sketchbook this way. So just be thoughtful about proportion. You want to try to maintain the proportions of your composition as you begin to draw it out on your paper. Now, how you do that is up to you. I taped mine off so that I'll have like nice clean boxes. I know some of you guys did that with your pen drawings, so you already have experience with doing that. You can set it up that way, or you can just go edge to edge on your sketchbook paper or whatever paper you have. If you want to tear it out and cut it down so that it's a little bit smaller, you can. So my boxes here are, where's my inches? Here we go. My boxes are 6 by 6, which is kind of small. I'm making mine small because I'm making 2 little paintings. You're making 1, so I want you to go a little bit bigger. It's going to depend on like the overall size of your paper. My sketchbook is a little bit big, but most of you probably have like a 9 by 12 piece of sketchbook paper. So within that, you could do like an 8 by 10 if you're working within a rectangle, or an 8 by 8 if you're working within a square is a good size. So try to utilize the size of the paper that you have. These do not have to be huge paintings, but just a little bigger than my small 6 by 6 square here will give you more room to mess around. And like I said, you could either tape it so that you have a nice clean edge, or you can just work edge to edge on the paper that you have to get set up. So then once you have your paper all established and oriented the way you're going to be making this painting, you have your surface all set, then I want you to do what's called setting a ground. And what this does is it creates a color field for you to work against instead of just working against the white of the paper. Not that working against the white of the paper is bad. This is just a different way to do it. This is how I always set up my own paintings and have success with it. So this color yellow that I chose is not random or arbitrary or anything. I've got a yellow backdrop. So what I did was I just I just mixed up a basic yellow, as close to the general color yellow that I saw in my photograph. And there are different yellows going on, right? It gets brighter over here. There's a shadow, so that's a darker yellow. There are different hues and shades happening, but I'm just gonna choose like the main color yellow that I see and try to match that as closely as possible. This is what I came out with. Now, it's not perfect, and I'm going to be changing it as I get painting, but for setting the ground, it'll work just fine. All right, so you're just going for like the basic, whatever color you've got going on in the background, mixing up a little batch of that, and then putting it on your paper. All right, just filling the paper with a flat version of that color. So my other photo, I believe I have it right here. Hope you guys can see this in the screen. My other photo that I'm gonna be working from for my second little painting over here has like a purplish backdrop. And again, it's got different values, different hues going on, but I'm just going to try to match one of these color purples. It doesn't even really matter, just to get some purple down on the paper before I begin drawing. All right, so just a basic base color of purple. I'm gonna do that right now so you can see. I've got my palette set up with my 3 primaries, black and white. I might not need all of them right now, but I just always have those colors there set up in my palette so that when I do need them, they're there. So I'm gonna mix up a purple that resembles the purple. I think I'll go on go for the slightly darker hue, slightly darker value of that purple as my ground. Just mixing it in my palette first. I am using a bigger brush if you have access to a bigger brush for setting your ground. That's good. If you don't have an option for brushes, just use what you have. Trying to mix up a lot of it so that I don't have to keep remixing it after. So this is the purple that I came out with. And I'm just gonna set my ground. As I get it down on the paper, I'm noticing that it's not really the closest match, but it's purple, so it's close enough for now. I am gonna go back and where the light hits it, lighten up that area. We'll be working back into the background. This is just a ground for me to work off of so that as I compare my colors, my greens in the plant, I'm not having to compare it to the white of the paper. I can compare it to a similar color that exists in the background of my photograph. So some of you might be wondering, well, what if my backdrop or my background, I used a white surface? And that could be the case if you couldn't find something colored to set your still life up on. If that's the case, I had done this painting last year as a demonstration, and I had my object set up on white. And what I would do in that case is I would just put down a very, very pale gray as a base. So what I used was like lots of white, but in the white I mixed a little bit of black and a little bit of blue, and I set a ground with just a very, very pale gray so that at least there was a value back there, not just the white of the paper. So if your backdrop is white, that's the route that I would go. So the next step, you're going to begin mapping in your composition, basically mapping in your subject. While this ground is drying, I'm going to just start doing that on my yellow ground, which is already dry. So you do this step once this is dry. Acrylic paint dries very, very quickly. So it will only take like 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how thick you use the paint, to dry, and then you can begin mapping in your ground. Now I'm going to do, mapping in your composition. Now I'm going to do it in 2 different ways just to show you some options. For the first one, I'm going to do it using pencil. All right, so I've got my pencil, and one thing that helps me maintain my composition when going from a photograph to a bigger piece of paper, or a bigger surface that I'm working on, like kind of scaling up a little bit, is making marks for myself as guidelines. Or I teach this a lot in Art 1. So if you had me for Art 1, you're probably used to this by now. But I want to make sure that I maintain my composition, right? When this leaf exits the composition, I want to maintain that. I want to make sure that this leaf in my photograph takes up like 1/4 of the square, right? So I just want to make sure that I maintain that. And in order to do that, I'm actually going to make marks. Like I'll make a mark for myself towards the corner where this leaf sort of enters the composition. I'll make a little mark where the top of this leaf comes right to the top of the composition. I might make a very faint line going across, showing that like the bottom half of this square is filled up with leaves. So if you make marks for yourself, it should help you maintain your composition better. So that's what I'm going to do first. So just simple marks. This is why it's important to make sure that if you're working within a square format for your photo, your piece of paper is also a square format. If you're working within a rectangle, your piece of paper is also a rectangle. You know, that seems really basic, but it's something that you should be thoughtful about. And not everyone is, unless I make a point of talking about it. All right, so I'm using my marks as a guide. This stem comes up, and this leaf almost touches the edge. Drawing very lightly against the dry acrylic paint. Okay, and for your next option for starting, I would imagine most of you are going to choose to go this route using a pencil. But for this example, I'm actually going to show you the way I typically tend to start a painting. So I usually will put down my colored ground first, but I am more comfortable with a paintbrush in hand. So I really prefer to sketch using a paintbrush. Notice how in the first one, we just used line with the pencil. I didn't get into shading anything. You don't have to get into shading. You're really just using a light line. Same thing with this one. I'm gonna just use a light line, but I'm gonna paint in the subject. Because my ground is fairly dark, I mixed up a darker version of that purple. So basically I took that same purple and I added a lot of black to it and I made an indigo color. And that's the color I'm going to use to sketch out my plant on this one. So if you wanna try something different, and you think you might like that approach, this is an option. You have choices. All right, you could go this route with the pencil, or you could try something new and go this route with the paintbrush. Like I said, this works for me because, I don't know, I'm just more comfortable using a paintbrush. And I also don't like to have to worry about pencil lines. I don't like pencil lines showing in my work, like towards the end, and this just makes it so that that's not an issue at all. So I would do just a slightly, when you go this route, if you decide to go this route, I would just choose a slightly darker version of that color. For the yellow, if I were going to be doing the same thing here, instead of using pencil, mapping it in with my brush, I would mix up a darker yellow. I could do that by adding a touch of black, or I could do that by adding a touch of purple, which is probably what I would do with the yellow to darken it slightly, would be to mix in the complement. That would also neutralize it. When you are done with that sitting, or any time you're done with a sitting, right? Like you've painted a little bit and then you're moving on to other things. You're going to go back to it the next day or that night or something like that. As I mentioned before, acrylic paint does dry very fast. If you have leftover acrylic paint in your palette, you should always cover it. So I just have these palettes at school that actually come with covers, where I can cover it easily while I'm not working with the acrylic paint. Another way that you could get set up with your acrylic paint, if you don't have a palette like that, is you could get a Tupperware container that has a lid. You could put a piece of saran wrap over like a paper plate if you want to use that as a palette. Any of those options will work fine.